Mahesh Jethmalani, does the Supreme Court not realize that the credibility of the judiciary is going for a toss with this temptation of getting into everything, with obvious judicial overreach? Does they not realize they're overstretching it?
Yeah, I think in recent times there is a growing feeling that the judiciary is over-intervening in areas that do not belong to it, that it's meddling in the executive preserve. I think it started it really started all with this anti-defection law business. It became very tempting for the judiciary. For instance, that whole Maharashtra assembly case, it just took too much time, and you kept a government that had come into existence on tenterhooks for the entire period of those 2 years that it ran the remainder of its tenure. It was a very simple matter. In that matter, Uddhav Thackeray had resigned as chief minister. That was the end of the matter. A new government had to be formed. Yet that anti-defection matter went on until today is pending in the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
So I find that sometimes some legislation invites the Supreme Court into executive preserves. Right now, that was a classic example, because after Uddhav Thackeray resigned as chief minister, there was no need. A new government had to be formed unless you wanted a fresh election, which is not the preserve of the judiciary. It's for the chief minister of the day to decide.
Why does the judiciary want to get into things? I'm just trying to understand. Is it because the opposition is weak? Is it because the whole lobby in Delhi is sort of encouraging it? Go get into it. We are behind you. This whole attempt at sort of pleasing, legal websites, wanting to remain relevant. Is it just that? Is it as innocent as just that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fact. It is. I mean, when an opposition is extremely weak and is constantly on the run and facing defeats time and time after over again, I suppose to some extent the judiciary does step in, and sometimes maybe checks, provides healthy checks on the executive excesses, right? But it can't be that you take your sometimes healthy checks, right, as being a pattern which you should forever follow. That is the.
But that way they can get into everything. They can get into everything. There's nothing in the name of judicial oversight. They can get into everything they want to.
The last example of their circumscribing and imposing time limits on the governor and the president in particular, right? And that issue was not even decided by a 5-judge bench. It's a very serious matter. It's a substantial question of law regarding the interpretation of the Constitution. If at all they wanted to go into it, that should have been done by a 5-judge bench. On that, the law is very clear. Article 145(3) says so. And I think that now really raises, and that's what got Vice President Dhankar's, ire. That's what happened, because you impose an arbitrary 3-month period on the president. And actually, it was the governor's conduct in that case, the governor of Tamil Nadu's conduct.
Yeah, but you have Kapil Sibal saying that don't forget the Supreme Court. Don't forget the president doesn't really have any powers. There are people who are egging the courts on. Go on, don't mind. But I know a lot of people upset that President Draupadi Murmu is being given instructions, like a headmaster gives to students by the Supreme Court. It's very upsetting. The President of India is being insulted by the process, I think. It's very sad.
Yeah, that kind of, there was also, I think the Supreme Court also failed in this case to give respect to the constitutional authorities. They may have, in the case of the governor, found his actions terribly wrong, the governor of Tamil Nadu. But I think it could have been dealt with much more finesse than it was actually was dealt with. And certainly, as far as the circumscribing the power of the president for 3 months was not even an issue in the case anymore, because the case was decided
case by case. For example, people said that Chandrachud was very fond of being in the media, so he would always make the kind of arguments, that would collide with the media and get quoted. And every judge wants to have a verdict or a judgment in their name that will make them go down the annals of history. In the case of Justice Chandrachud, it is always going to be the Arnab Goswami versus State of Maharashtra case. And whether Justice Chandrachud likes it or not, I will always say that the time I expected him to speak was during this Yashwant Verma case. I'm so disappointed that Justice Chandrachud chose not to say anything about that case. So when it comes to sticking their neck out on issues, they do not want to talk about it. But on other occasion, one gets the feeling that they're egged on to almost becoming an unelected opposition in the country. Or maybe in the Prime Minister Modi's time, there is a group that wants them to play that role, which they must resist that temptation.
Well,
wanting to play that role.
Remember one thing, Arnab, as far as the opposition is concerned, they are the most inconsistent because
but they're trying to shoot off the court's
on the one
shoulder.
hand, they supported the NJC. They unanimously supported the NJC in Parliament, right? Now what happens is every time they get a setback from the courts, right? For instance, the very same Kapil Sibal who's now taking up cudgels for the judiciary against Vice President Dhankar, only the other day wanted to impeach Justice Deepak Mishra. He was talking about impeaching him.
The question,
because
not the name.
So
the question is not executive versus judiciary. It's a long one. Yeah.
That inconsistent. Their responses are all knee-jerk. It depends upon the judgments. The result of the judgments in which they're interested in. If it goes against them, then the judiciary is terrible. If it goes in their favor, then of course they take up cudgels for the judiciary. So they are not consistent at all.
Sometimes do you think
as far as the opposition is concerned,
should not get into everything and then at the end of what happens is when if the Supreme Court does not dismiss something over, either it picks up and decides quickly. But for example, in the CA case, right? The CA was to fast-track citizenship for persecuted non-Muslims from neighboring countries, right? As usual, it was swiftly challenged by the Indian Union Muslim League, claiming it violated Article 24. And then in March last year, the Supreme Court refused to say the CA's implementation, allowing the law to take into effect. But then it took time. I mean, months and years pass in the process. The issue gets intensely politicized. The resolution that Parliament seeks does not happen. And on everything today, 370, NJC, appointment of Chief Election Commissioner, Waqf law, everything the court has to get into it. Then the focus is not on what the government wants to do, but what the court decides on what the government does. In other words, then the court becomes a super government.
Well, there is a tendency, there has been a tendency in the last 3 years for the Supreme Court to try and encroach on...
Why? I'm trying to understand why. Do the honorable judges not know the Lakshman Rekha?
No, they do. But it has to be pointed out to them in court that this...
But then they talk about the freedom of the media, and then they're constantly commenting on the media. I mean, I also have a grouse as a media person. I say constantly passing judgments on the media, observations on the media, wanting to control the media, wanting to decide the media's agenda, observation, not necessary.
But it does not, to be fair to the Supreme Court, it doesn't do it suo motu. Most of the time, it's a group of public interest litigants.
Yeah, but the court is to decide.
Financed by NGOs
But there's a basic structure.
Dubious origins that bring these matters to court. And then I guess the Supreme Court feels compelled to decide on it, and it takes time.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm just extremely concerned. What I'm concerned about, Mahesh, as I wrap this up, let me tell you the poll results so far. That's what causes me concern. Because as of now, and I believe 95% of people on this live poll, digitally live poll are saying there's judicial overreach in India.
Arnab, that poll result may partly be because in recent times, thanks to that Yashwant Verma episode, right?
The credibility is fallen.
The judiciary the credibility has plummeted. And I would only suggest that the judiciary resolve this in-house inquiry as soon as possible. The sooner that is done, the better it will be for the credibility of the judiciary. So those plummeting figures which you're seeing have something to do with them own delay in cleaning up their audience tables.
Yeah, they need to. Well, thank you very much, Mahesh. Always
thank you,
a pleasure. Thank you very much.